This comes from Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was the commander-in-chief when our nation was plunged into its Second World War. World War II was one of, if not the most infamous event in U.S. history. This had numerous implications in all aspects of American life, especially in politics, economics, and society. Now, this is an era full of many important events, so to cover it, let's start from the beginning. This all started when Germany invaded Poland in the fall of 1939. Politically, the United States was reluctant to be involved in a foreign war. Isolationists preached that it wasn't our fight, and we didn't need a repeat of World War I. Even though we weren't going to war, we still wanted to help our allies. To avoid a repeat of World War I, the United States came up with the Neutrality Act of 1939, which allowed only a cash-and-carry policy. This meant that for our allies to receive any war supplies from us, they had to pay up front and couldn't take now and pay it back after the war. Besides the war, the Holocaust was in full swing in Germany. In the U.S., Americans were very reluctant to take in Jewish refugees. In fact, we turned away a ship full of 937 Jews fleeing from persecution aboard the ship the St. Louis. By the end of the war, the U.S. only took in 150,000 Jews under the War Refugee Board created by Roosevelt, which were remarkably low compared to other nations. Looking back, it isn't a very bright spot on America's record, ignoring all the Jewish people in need of a place to go. Despite America's majority isolationist views, the fall of France shook many people's beliefs. This brought the realization that we can't just sit and watch the rest of free Europe fall to Nazi Germany. Although we remained out of the war officially, Congress appropriated $37 billion in 1 year to prepare for war. Also, under the conscription law passed on September 6, 1940, a peacetime draft was instated, with 1.2 million troops and 800,000 reserve troops being drafted. The United States took to the policy of helping their allies by all methods short of war. With the country on the brink of war, the 1940 presidential election had arrived, and during it, Roosevelt broke the two-term tradition. By defeating Wendell Willkie, he was elected to his third of 4 terms. The political climate of the time called for an experienced and proven leader, not Willkie, who came out of nowhere to run for the Republican Party in this election. Shortly after the election, the Lend-Lease Bill was enacted. This was pushed by the idea of it's better to lose supplies than American lives. This was another step towards the U.S. joining the war. As for the economy, the people were doing far better. With jobs returning as a response to the wartime need, the unemployment rate decreased. However, government spending skyrocketed, which plunged the country into debt. And to this day, we continue to increase the fiscal hole we are in. Now, ever since this war started, the United States had been getting closer to joining. But the final factor that pushed Americans into the war was the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese pulled off a surprise bombing of the Pearl Harbor military base in Hawaii. This attack came without warning, and the aftermath it left caused Americans to go into an uproar. This was the only attack on American soil throughout the entirety of the war, and will forever be remembered as the event that got America into the war. Once the United States was officially at war, Executive Order No. 9066 was enacted. This act singled out all Japanese in the U.S., even those who had lived here their whole life, and put them into internment camps, on the basis that they may be a threat to the country. This was an awful decision, as we discriminated against so many Japanese Americans who were just as patriotic as their neighbors. Although they were later compensated in 1988 when the government officially apologized and gave $20,000 to each camp survivor, it is still a huge blight in how we treated minorities during this time. With American men now being shipped overseas to fight, many women had to step up to fill factory jobs and other positions left open by American soldiers. In total, about 6 million women got a job during this time. Also, for the first time in American history, women could join the military. 216,000 women enlisted, either in the Army through the WAC, Women's Army Corps, the Navy through WAVES, Women's Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, and the Coast Guard through SPARS, U.S. Coast Guard Women's Reserves. Another dramatic shift on the domestic side of the war was a large internal migration. Many Americans left the South, especially as African Americans left the South as newfound jobs arose in the West and North. California rose in population by 2 million people alone. The FEPC, or the Fair Employment Practices Commission, banned discrimination in military jobs and other federally controlled services. In general, the war helped strengthen the black community. This job freedom for African Americans was in large part due to the invention of the mechanical cotton picker. Its impact rivaled the scale of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. As for the minorities that were drafted or enlisted into the military, they were usually put into specific areas based on their race. For example, blacks usually were put into non-combat units, and Native Americans were used as code talkers. They would speak in their native tongue, and the enemies were unable to decipher any messages they intercepted. Although the war brought some changes at home, for the most part, the everyday lives of Americans were greatly unaffected by the war. As one of the few countries that didn't have any fighting going on in-country, there was no casualties on the mainland of the U.S., besides for the anomaly of a few people in Oregon. Back to the war taking place, the Japanese started off with an alarming amount of military success in the Pacific Theater. Although they had initial success and expanded out, at the Battle of Midway, the tides turned. Americans resisted the Japanese assault and proceeded to start pushing back through a leapfrog strategy. American forces would overtake weak, unfortified islands and use these as stops on their way to the mainland. This was very successful because they could just skip the heavily fortified islands and avoid them completely. This weakened the Japanese to the point where they had no hope of winning this war. But the Japanese culture led to an attitude of death before surrender. So even though they knew they couldn't win, they would fight to the very last man. On the other side of the world, the Axis powers were being brought to a screeching halt as well. After starting the war by invading Poland, Hitler continued in his conquest of Europe. It seemed like the madman would take over all of Europe at first. But as the war dragged on, Hitler began fighting a war on two fronts. One side against Britain and the US, on the other side Russia. This fighting on both sides was impossible to keep up. Germany's downfall came after a failed attempt to quickly take down Russia. This invasion failed because the Russians simply retreated, while burning down everything in their retreat. This strategy left Germany tired and low on supplies and morale. Eventually they had to succumb to the harsh Russian winters and retreat. This led massive failure on Hitler's part started the chain of losses that led to the last struggle. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last hurrah in the modern-day terms. You could say he was gonna send it. Which translates to he knew he was losing, so he put all the military might he had left into pushing as far into Allied territory as he could. Hoping to reach the Belgian port of Antwerp, he failed to reach this point mainly from the impressive resistance of the troops in Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division fought to the very end, slowing the Nazi offensive and taking away the momentum they had. Shortly after this battle, on December 16, 1944, Germany finally surrendered on May 7, 1945, finally ending the war in Europe. This, however, was only half the war. Japan still refused to give up, and with fear of losing more men to war, the U.S. did something so extreme that has yet to be repeated. That is, of course, the dropping of the atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These bombs, developed by the Manhattan Project, were so insanely powerful, they instantly vaporized 70,000 people, along with 180,000 killed from the initial blast as well. This followed by 60,000 more who perished from radiation sickness. These bombs contained power that is too destructive even for war. They left civilians literally vaporized into permanent shadows. This showed that Japan could either surrender or be obliterated. After these bombings on August 6th and 8th, 1945, Japan finally surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. This surrender finally brought peace to the world. Although short-lived, this peace was a huge relief to people all around the world. For American people, they were ushered into the 1950s with a prosperous economy and a far better quality of life, compared to the generation before who lived through the Great Depression. In conclusion, World War II will never be forgotten, and that's not such a bad thing. We can learn from this and make sure to never have another catastrophic world war. In the words of Albert Einstein, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.